In wartime Berlin, women using the city's train network at night were falling victim to a psychotic serial killer.
The Kriminalpolizei reports said that he was cold-blooded, that he was a sociopath, and he was someone that had no feeling for his victims whatsoever.
But despite desperate attempts by the police to catch the murderer, the Nazi high command wanted to keep the investigation a secret.
The authorities didn't want the population to get frightened or to feel that the authorities were not in control of the situation. Tremendous limitations were placed on what could be released to the general public.
Wilhelm Hermann Goering.
I think it's a very fertile ground, conspiracy theorists. He wound an electric flex wire around.
No home in the world untouched.
Yes, he had not committed suicide, but that he had been murdered.
Defendants make final statements to the tribunal.
Ich selbst möchte aber hier ganz aus der Tiefe meines
During World War II, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany had caused the Nazis to issue blackout orders in all major cities across the Reich. And as war raged across Europe during the largest conflict mankind had ever seen, the people of Berlin spent their evenings in almost complete darkness. But for women traveling on the S-Bahn train network, they had to contend with the added terror of knowing a serial killer stalked the carriages at night. Under the new Nazi government, construction of the Berlin S-Bahn commenced in 1934. The last phase of the project was finally completed in 1939, 1 month after the start of the Second World War.
The S-Bahn, the S comes from Schnell, meaning fast. It's basically an overground suburban railway. The network of S-Bahn lines that runs right across Berlin still does. Goes right out into the suburbs and runs till very late at night.
It's an absolutely crucial part of public transport. It's as central to a Berliner's life as the tube is to a Londoner or the subway is to a New Yorker. It's absolutely one of the arteries of communication within the city. The whole way of life of Berlin is tied up with the S-Bahn.
And it was the way that the majority of Berliners would have got to work in the morning.
The S-Bahn was vital to the German war effort, transporting workers to and from the factories around Berlin. But as the war progressed and more German men left for the front line, it was up to the women of Berlin to continue the fight on the home front.
From 1939 onwards, all of the men, the younger men, from, the age of 18 to 41, they're fighting in the war.
So women are being called into industrial work for the first time. So there's a greater proportion of women riding the S-Bahn on a daily basis.
But with its factories, infrastructure, and prominent position within the Reich, Berlin was an obvious target for the Allies. And its location was well within striking distance of the British RAF bombers.
The blackout order was given on the first day of the war, on 1st of September 1939 in Germany. And it effectively meant that any light source visible from above 500 meters, so visible from the air, had to be shrouded or covered and otherwise made invisible. And this meant generally that you had to sort of tape up windows, you had to have thick blackout curtains for doors and so on at night time. All street lights would be either turned off or shrouded.
And so the blackout was as total in Berlin as it would have been in London. So it was taken very seriously indeed.
And this, of course, caused a degree of chaos for the people of Berlin, because they weren't used to that. Berlin was very much, a lively modern city with neon lights, street lights and traffic and everything else. And to suddenly plunge that world into darkness was a big shock for a lot of people.
While the Berlin blackout served to hinder the accuracy of the Allied bombers, it also created an environment in which crime was able to thrive.
It was a very surreal twilight atmosphere in cities under bombardment at war, and all sorts of nefarious deeds went on under the cover of darkness.
There is an upsurge in crime, robbery, prostitution, all of that stuff. And there's a massive spike in accidental death. Car accidents, people falling on train tracks, people falling in front of trams.
The discovery of dead bodies around the streets of Berlin was nothing unusual for the time.
On average, in the winter of 1940, there is one person being killed every night in Berlin, thanks to accidents in the blackout. So you have a huge amount of deaths for the police to sift through.
But in early December of 1940, Dr. Waldemar Weimann, a renowned forensic pathologist, was called to the scene of a body found by the tracks of the S-Bahn. The woman was identified as Elfriede Franke, and at first glance it seemed possible that she had accidentally fallen from a moving train. But a closer examination would be required to determine the cause of death. On inspection of Elfriede Franke's head wounds, Dr. Weimann noticed several unique features inconsistent with the theory of accidental death. Dr. Sven Hartwig is a pathologist at the Charité Institute in Berlin, where Dr. Weimann originally conducted the autopsy in 1940.
Als das erste Opfer gefunden wurde, ist man ursprünglich von einem Unfall oder Suizid ausgegangen. Man hat aber relativ schnell erkannt, dass es unterschiedliche Verletzungen am Kopf gegeben hat, die nicht allein durch den Sturz aus der S-Bahn zu erklären waren. Und eine Verletzung, die damals auffällig gewesen ist, ist zum Beispiel dieser Impressionsbruch des Schädeldaches, der nur durch einen entsprechend geformten Gegenstand entstehen konnte und nichts mit dem Sturz aus der S-Bahn zu tun hatte. Mit einem Unfall nicht erklären und auch nicht mit einem Suizid.
Weimann had established that she had been murdered, but why and by whom were the questions that now needed answering. It had been another night of the Berlin blackouts, and in the complete darkness of the S-Bahn train, Elfriede Franke, a 26-year-old nurse, was returning home at night after a long shift.
The S-Bahn, like everything else, would be blacked out, so there'd be no light visible from the S-Bahn carriages at all.
Franke was the only passenger traveling in the second-class carriage that night. That was until she reached Karlshorst station in the suburbs of Berlin. She would hardly have been able to make out the features on the man who boarded the train, even as he made his way down the carriage towards her. It would take time for the police to realize that Elfriede Franke was not his first victim. But they would soon find out that she would not be his last.
Blacked out, coming home late at night. It's a perfect scenario for a serial killer.
That same evening, Dr. Weimann received another corpse into the morgue. Nothing unusual for wartime Berlin, except this body bore a similar head wound to the one found on Elfriede Franke.
Die Rechtsmediziner haben damals erkannt, dass es an diesen Opfern vergleichbare Verletzungen gibt. Also sie haben erkannt, dass es sich um ein und dasselbe Werkzeug gehandelt haben muss.
The first time it all starts coming together is in the double killing. And the reason that's important is that one of the killings, a woman has clearly been thrown from the S-Bahn. And the other one has taken place on a street, by the railway lines, but on the street. And they're only a few hundred meters apart. And so the picture starts beginning to come together.
19-year-old Irmgard Fries had been walking home alone at night, close to the Berlin-Karlshorst railway station. It had been no more than 30 minutes since the killer had last struck. But his murder spree had not yet ended.
Two murders in a single day. One on the train and one next to the train tracks. And at that point, the police realized that they have a serial killer on their hands.
A crime of this nature was a serious concern to the Nazi Party, and the case was quickly picked up by the German criminal police force, known as the Kripo.
The Kripo is a shortening of the words Kriminalpolizei, criminal police. They were the old-fashioned police detective investigation branch.
The Kripo, the Kriminalpolizei, was a special organization dealing with serious crime. So it dealt with murder, rape, serious robbery, and so on.
Leading the investigation was Police Commissioner Wilhelm Ludke of the Serious Crimes Unit in Berlin.
Wilhelm Ludke was relatively unusual in the sense that he was a high-ranking officer, and he was perhaps not a fervent believer in Nazism. He did join the Nazi Party, but very late in the day, and probably for reasons of professional advancement. So he was someone who was relatively objective about the investigation that he was carrying out.
Before Germany had come under complete Nazi control, he had been a member of the Democratic Party and actively worked against Hitler's rise to power. But despite making many powerful enemies in the regime's early years, even the Nazi government had realized his skills as a detective far outweighed his political leanings.
Ludke is not a character who has a tremendous amount of public profile, except for the fact that he was very highly regarded at the time. He had solved more murders than any other serving detective. So you have to think of Ludke as being like one of the top detectives in Germany, a really experienced, hard-nosed professional.
Ludke and his team of detectives were eager to mount a full and swift investigation into the murders. They wanted to make a public appeal for witnesses to come forward, but also make sure that women traveling on the S-Bahn remained vigilant while the murderer was still at large. But the Reich Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, wanted an altogether different approach.
The normal reaction would be that the press would get onto the story, it would be splashed across the newspapers and on television, and that would not only inform the public that there was a risk out there, it would also potentially bring new leads of inquiry into the investigation. Things didn't work like that in Nazi Germany.
Goebbels had the news blackout on this. He controls all of the newspapers through his daily press conference. So this case doesn't appear in all the German newspapers. They're not putting out a kind of, wanted poster.
For reasons of propaganda, the authorities didn't want the population to get frightened or to feel that the authorities were not in control of the situation. They wanted to maintain the fiction that all was well. And so tremendous limitations were placed till really quite late in the case on what could be released to the general public.
Hindered by the constraints of having to keep the investigation as quiet as possible, Ludke decided to search the records for similar cases to see if the killer had struck before. The police were able to link 6 previous attacks to the killer, all of them having taken place either on the S-Bahn itself or in and around a small part of Berlin known as the Garden area.
There is a clear escalation. So initially, the early assaults are almost comical. They are jumping out and shining a torch in a woman's eyes at night, for example, which then graduates to sexual assault, to physical assault, and then, of course, to rape and murder.
One of the things that you see is actually quite common amongst this type of psychopathology, and it's this sort of escalation that it's closer and closer approximations to the behavior that you ultimately want. So you don't kill right away, but you violate, you harm, you show sadistic behavior. Oftentimes we see this sort of combined with sort of sexual gratification.
While many of the previous attacks had been either failed or opportunistic attempts, one had resulted in the fatal stabbing of a young mother from the garden area of Berlin, named Gertrude Ditter.
A killing has happened in September in a shack in an allotment in Friedrichsfelde.
The first murder that he commits is not actually on the S-Bahn at all. It's in what's known as the Laubenviertel, which was an area of small houses, often wooden houses, where effectively the poor, the proletariat of Berlin tended to live. And his first murder was of a woman there in the autumn of 1940. That was investigated by the police, of course, but was seen, I think, initially as a one-off. It wasn't connected to any of the previous crimes, the assaults and so on.
Until now, the Berlin police had failed to link the crimes to one single perpetrator, primarily because there did not seem to be a consistent pattern to the attacks. This allowed the killer to build up to his murders by learning from his mistakes and honing his craft.
When a serial killer begins to kill, you look at the methods employed, you look at whether there's like a temporal rhythm to it, how often they're doing it, you look if there's a certain type of person that they're targeting in a certain location. And one of the things that we know was happening in this case is that there wasn't as many patterns as you'd expect. Actually, he would change the way he killed.
He changed his modus operandi a number of times. His first victim was killed away from the train tracks. He used predominantly battery, so he would batter women over the head. Occasionally there was sexual assault and rape, but not always. And then occasionally he also used stabbing. So he used a number of different methods.
There appear to be different motivations in the sense that some are clearly sexual attacks and some appear to be just assaults, just violent assaults.
He would use different means, and I think that would have been very difficult for the detectives on the case.
Although there was no clear pattern to the attacks, they all had one crucial thing connecting them.
The common factor was the proximity to the S-Bahn in East Central Berlin. That was the thing that linked all of his murders.
Now that he had a taste for it, the police knew that it was only a matter of time until he would kill again. But they now had a vital new piece of evidence.
The killer, for most of his murders, used a length of lead cabling, probably about 18 inches long, which the investigators think he used to keep up his sleeve so that he could then slide it down his sleeve and into his hand. And this, could be brought down onto the head of a victim with tremendous force.
Here at the Landesarchiv in Berlin, they hold the original case files on the S-Bahn murderer. Dr. Jens Dobler is the official historian for the Berlin Police Department.
Okay, also an dem ersten Fall, das war noch ein Mordversuch, wurde ein Tatwerkzeug gefunden, nämlich ein Bleikabel, in dem innen weitere farbige Kabel verlaufen sind.
The piece of 2-inch thick lead-encased telephone cable was the kind you could have found at any industrial construction site across Berlin. But the Kripo detectives painstakingly scoured every cable fabrication company in Germany until they found its manufacturer. From the shipping records, they were able to determine that the cable used as a weapon in the attack had been destined for use on the S-Bahn railway.
Zeigt also, dass auch über diese kriminaltechnischen Maßnahmen sich sozusagen die Schlinge zuzieht und die Ermittlungen in Richtung Reichsbahnbeamte geführt werden.
The police were now certain that the murderer was an employee of the S-Bahn railway. But this conclusion would not sit well with the Nazi high command.
Although they had a very clear idea quite early on that it almost certainly was an employee of the S-Bahn, because Nazi ideology said, no, 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 it must be a Jew, it must be a foreign worker, it must be an Untermensch, there were pressures on them, as it were, to look somewhere else, to look among foreign workers, to look among Jews, even though Jews weren't allowed on the railway.
To keep the regime happy, Ludke had to publicly investigate the possibility that the killer was not a German citizen.
There's appeals for information, there's leafleting, they put posters up around foreign labourer work camps, which there are a few in the area. They seem to be convinced that it must be a foreigner who's committing these murders. So they try to appeal for information from those places.
But even though Goebbels tried to keep the murders quiet, word that there was a killer on the loose soon began to spread.
People in Berlin tended to know what was going on. There was an urban grapevine, and people knew that there was a killer at large. So there are a number of accounts of people talking about this spate of killings. So it was certainly known about by the people of Berlin.
Der Fall brachte die Polizei ja in erhebliche Bedrohung, weil es doch sehr viel Proteste gab, dass sie die Ermittlungen so hinschleppten und immer mehr Frauen also in der Gefahr sich fanden und auch sich weigerten, S-Bahn zu fahren. Also es ist ein erheblicher öffentlicher Druck auch aufgebaut worden.
Women refusing to travel the S-Bahn to work could have impacted production for the German war effort. Something that Ludke knew could have potentially fatal consequences, even for himself.
In any serial killing, one murder happens after another. The police are bound to be under tremendous pressure. When it's happening in the capital of the Third Reich, the kind of pressure you're under is of a completely different order. You're under pressure from people who can have you killed, who can make you disappear. So they are really desperate to try and solve this crime, both to save the lives of future victims, and I guess, in the back of their minds, kind of to save their own lives too.
Und insofern wurden umfangreiche Fahndungsmaßnahmen eingeleitet. Hunderte von Personen waren im Einsatz, um die S-Bahn zu bewachen, haben die Strecken begleitet, haben Wachen aufgestellt. Auch das Bahnpersonal wurde mit in die Fahndungsmaßnahmen einbezogen.
Despite pressure from the regime to investigate foreigners for the crimes, Ludke also continued to pursue evidence that the killer was an employee of the railways.
The detectives really stuck at their task, and they did proper, good, solid policing. They interviewed 3,000 employees of the S-Bahn. They started putting people onto the trains, see if they could attract the murderer to attack one of their people.
The detectives came up with a plan to plant people on the train in a bid to catch the murderer, drafting in officers from the women's branch of the Kripo to act as the bait.
And that approach almost bore fruit.
While on night patrol one evening, the officer watched as a figure appeared out of the darkness of the carriage and made his way towards her. But to the killer, something about this potential victim seemed different.
Oh, hang on. This woman doesn't feel quite the same as the others.
He seems to have become spooked, and when the train pulled into the station, ran off.
And she chased after him, other police chased after him, he ran off the tracks, and they lost him in the darkness. I mean, they came this close to getting the killer.
The Kripo had come close to catching the killer by using the female police officers as bait. So they decided to employ the same method again. But this time, they would make a small adjustment to the plan.
Es war also eine sehr große und auch systematische Arbeit gewesen. Ein Spezifikum dieser Fahndungsmaßnahmen war, worüber wir heute so ein bisschen schmunzeln, aber damals war es natürlich tödlich ernst, war, dass sich eine ganze Reihe, nämlich ungefähr 6, 7 Polizeibeamte als Frauen verkleidet haben. Und zwar sind sie dann also in der S-Bahn gefahren nachts als verkleidete Frauen in der Hoffnung, dass sich der Mörder sozusagen an sie ranschleicht und dass sie ihn dann also überführen können.
These were singularly unconvincing, not least, as it turns out, because men by and large are bigger than women, and the killer, as they finally realized towards the very end, one of the common denominators of his victims was they were all small, people he felt he could easily overpower.
But all the police efforts had been in vain, as less than 2 weeks after the night of the double murder, workers found the discarded body of Elisabeth Bungurner on the tracks near Ransdorf station. Over the next 3 months, a further 3 women would also be attacked and murdered on the S-Bahn. With the body count rising, Ludke was in desperate need of a breakthrough. But the killer had gone to ground. Nearly 5 months would pass before he would strike again.
This is the 8th victim, 35-year-old woman. And in the subsequent investigation, it's discovered that a boot print has been left at the scene.
Bei jedem Mordfall wird eine Tatortzeichnung klassischerweise angefertigt von den Polizeizeichnern. In dieser Zeichnung ist der Standort der Leiche drin, dann alle Arten von Spuren, die gefunden werden und auch die Umgebung, damit man das also jederzeit nachvollziehen kann. Und hier bei dem Fall der Frau Ogorzow, übrigens der letzte Fall, kann man eigentlich sehr gut nachzeichnen, dass also mit Fußspuren gearbeitet wurde. Es wurden also Fußspuren gefunden.
The footprint was the break the police had been hoping for, and Ludke quickly ordered his detectives to get to work tracking down the man who had been standing by the body.
Because at the time, Berliners had rationing, and so they had to give coupons over for the shoes, they were able to find out exactly who had given coupons to buy these shoes.
They were able to make a match to a Mr. W. Hyman, a carpenter who lived less than 300 meters from the crime scene. When investigators checked his records, they also discovered that he had previous convictions for sex crimes. Based on this evidence, Hyman was brought in for questioning. The evidence placed him at the scene of the murder, and his prior history of sex crimes meant that he fitted the killer's profile. The Kripo were convinced that they had their man. They proceeded to interrogate him in the hope of obtaining a confession and getting a resolution to the case.
They'd got the footprint, Bayat body, they'd got a creep. In Nazi Germany, it would have been the work of an instant to get him eradicated. End of problem, end of grief they're getting from the Reich Main Security Office. Job done.
But as the interview unfolded, they soon realized that something was not adding up. Hyman was able to provide them with cast-iron alibis for the previous murders, and witnesses were able to corroborate his story. So how had his footprint come to be found beside the body of Frieda Koziel?
It turned out it wasn't the killer. It was a peeping Tom who liked to kind of prowl in the neighborhood, seeing if he could see women undressing or couples at it. Found what he thought was a sleeping woman lying there, saw the wound in her head, and then did a runner. They caught him, they found him, only to discover that they'd got the wrong guy.
The investigation was back to having no suspect. At a loss, Ludke ordered his detectives to go over the work rosters of all the S-Bahn workers until they had narrowed it down to employees whose shift patterns could have potentially matched with the murder sprees.
Late on in the case, Ludke says, no, let's go back and let's just see if we can find anybody, go through all the interviews all over again and find people who have, if you like, anything that may tie them to one of the killings. And they come up with a list of 8 people.
What they did at that point was to re-interview their list of suspects. And in that process, one name kept coming up, which was that of Paul Ogorzow, who was an assistant signalman on the S-Bahn. His name kept coming up because he was renowned amongst his work colleagues for having very outspoken misogynist views. He was someone who a number of his colleagues said frequently absconded in the middle of his shift, jumped the fence and ran home. So he was someone who certainly acted in a suspicious manner.
One of the things that we know in Ogorzow's case is that he spoke about women with a lot of contempt. So this idea of seeing them as objects, of seeing them as things to be used, this is certainly something that we see with sociopaths and also violent sexual predators.
The science of criminal profiling, people think of that as an FBI invention in the 1970s. It's absolutely not. The German police were onto it in the 20s and 30s. In fact, the phrase serial killer, Serienmörder, was created by the Berlin murder squad.
But if Ogorzow had been known to act so suspiciously, why had it taken the police so long to investigate him?
Paul Ogorzow was among the very first tranche of people to be interviewed by the police, right back in the summer and autumn of 1940. So even before he'd killed the first time, he'd already been interviewed.
He had, of course, been interviewed before by the police, and he was someone that, as far as the Kripo were concerned, initially was a fine, upstanding German. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He was a member of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. He was someone who they considered to be very much the backbone of Nazi Germany. So the initial investigation was actually suspended against Ogorzow because they considered that this was someone who was beyond reproach.
The police decided to re-interview Ogorzow, but this time he failed to provide them with satisfactory answers.
But there were a couple of killings for which he couldn't explain his whereabouts. Now they have the pieces beginning to fit together. So now they can go after him. The man who actually arrested Paul Ogorzow was a young detective, 28-year-old, called Georg Heuser. He was a very brilliant young detective. He'd passed out top of the leader school, which is the cadet school for detectives. His reward for that had been to be made Ludke's assistant.
Ludke left it to Heuser to conduct the interview, instructing him to make Ogorzow feel comfortable.
He was a staunch Nazi, a true believer, and he was sent in effectively to play the good cop in the interrogation, to put an arm around Ogorzow and say, come on, you can tell me, we're on the same side here, that sort of thing.
It would later be revealed that Heuser had more in common with Ogorzow than anyone had realized.
It's almost as if this young guy, almost exactly the same age as Ogorzow, they're born within a few months of each other, sits down, 2 young guys together, having a bit of a chat, softening him up.
Just as Ogorzow began to feel at ease, Ludke came in and took over.
In comes the tough, grizzled cop. Enough of this. Bosh, let's get down to the hard stuff.
The premise of good cop, bad cop is being made to feel that you have a sense of safety and security. if you're able to kind of fear someone in the room and be angry at them, but then seek refuge with the other person in the room, and hopefully that refuge means being honest about what happened, at least giving some details, striking a deal, then you're more likely to do that.
Ogorzow's first instinct is to say, I'm a good party man, because that is in fact his best defense. He joined the party in 1931, so he was a good, solid party member from way back in the day, before they were in power. And Ludke was also a party member, less out of any affiliation, but almost as a requirement of your police career. So he says, you're a good party man, I'm a party man, do us a favor. And then, again, to Ludke's credit, he says, I don't care. You're a disgrace to the party, so now let's talk about your crimes.
And this didn't initially bear fruit. Ogorzow had various excuses for his presence where he'd been at various times, and he was quite adept at explaining away the evidence that the Kripo had.
But Ogorzow remained tight-lipped, and Ludke didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction. So he pinned his hopes on conducting a forensic analysis of his railway uniform.
An der Uniform von Ogorzow sind Blutspuren gesichert worden, die er ursprünglich damit erklärte, dass er mit seiner Frau, die zu diesem Zeitpunkt menstruierte, Geschlechtsverkehr hatte.
The police, of course, asked his wife if this was the case, and initially she said yes, that was true. However, she made it known to the police that she was changing her story, that that was not the case, and that blood did not come from her.
Spätere Untersuchungen zeigten aber, dass die Blutantragungen an seiner Uniform ein ganz feines Sprühmuster hatten, was sich durch einen Geschlechtsverkehr eigentlich gar nicht erklärt hat, sondern tatsächlich dadurch, dass er einem Opfer eine Wunde durch stumpfe Gewalt zugeführt hat.
But in a time before DNA, and with forensic techniques still in their infancy, the amount recovered was not enough to test against the victim's blood type. So Ludke and Heuser decided to take Ogorzow back to the scenes of the crimes in the hope of provoking a reaction.
Hier haben wir also einen Übersichtsplan, der eigentlich auch sehr interessant ist, der damals angelegt wurde, in dem nämlich alle Taten, alle Versuche und alle vollendeten Fälle aufgeführt wurden. Und wir haben hier also die S-Bahn-Strecke, U-Bahnhof. Man kann also hier schön sehen, dass es schon also in Rummelsburg losgeht. Dann in dieser Kleingartensiedlung sind am meisten Taten passiert, bis hin nach Karlshorst.
Ludke takes Ogorzow out to the scenes of his first crimes in Friedrichsfelde, in the allotments, and walks him through the allotments.
For some criminals, it does help taking them back to the scene of the crime. For others, it doesn't. A lot of them enjoy the celebrity. So the longer they can drag something out, the better.
He stops by places where they know he's committed serious crimes and says, oh, well, something happened here, but it was nothing much. Initially just says, yeah, okay, I did the odd thing here. You know, I remember I shone a torch in a woman's face just to see her reaction, or I would say dirty things to them. And he starts giving himself away.
But they had one more trick up their sleeve. Gertrude Nieswand had been one of Ogorzow's early victims who survived the attack. Ludke had arranged for her to be waiting in the garden area to both identify and confront the man who had attempted to murder her.
Now they have corroborating evidence because they've got people who've seen him. Not necessarily for the murders, but at least they've got him on the assaults.
Ludke was wearing his suspect down, but too much was riding on this case for him not to obtain a full confession. So in a last-ditch attempt, he delivered his final blow.
The final stage of the interrogation is I think, a great theatrical moment. It's one of those things that you couldn't make it up.
This was the moment that turned the investigation.
And then, like the kind of magician's flourish.
Ludke had on his desk a number of the skulls of Ogorzow's victims.
And says, these are the women you killed. And that's the moment at which Ogorzow cracks. Somehow it overwhelms him, the reality of what he's done becomes clear to him. He starts confessing, and they know they've got him.
At the end of that confession, he admitted to 8 counts of murder, a further 6 counts of attempted murder, and 31 counts of assault.
When the skulls were revealed, it would have been a confrontation with, the physicality of what he'd done. What they were trying to do was to kind of say, we have you.
Ogorzow also confessed to crimes that the police were not even aware of.
Some of those assaults that Ogorzow gave his name to had not either been reported to the police, or the police had certainly not linked in with the S-Bahn killings.
At his trial, Ogorzow pleaded guilty to all charges.
He was duly convicted of 8 counts of murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, and was sentenced to death. And 2 days later was executed by guillotine in Plötzensee prison in Berlin.
One of the things that is bizarre about this case is the irony that here we are talking about a serial killer who killed 8 people in a city which is ruled by one of the greatest examples of institutional serial killing the world has ever seen. At the period these crimes are happening is precisely when the Holocaust is being planned. So there's this terrible sin that is occurring at the same time as these murders.
It's a sad fact that of the 3 men present in that interrogation room, it was not Paul Ogorzow who turned out to be the most prolific murderer.
Georg Heuser is the person who drew me to this story. He's a fascinating, troubling character. He was a brilliant young detective. He did something heroic. He's a good cop at this point. Later
that year, 1941, he was called up, as many policemen were, to serve in the Einsatzgruppen, which were mobile killing squads. Their task was essentially to round up Soviet civilians, predominantly Jews, anyone effectively that the Nazis didn't like, and they would be marched out of town, ditches would be dug, and they would be shot into ditches.
Heuser was not only instrumental in organizing all that, he was one of the killers.
He was finally caught up with in the 1950s and was taken to trial and was imprisoned as an accessory in 11,000 counts of murder.
So you had somebody who'd been a hero, an absolute hero, a guy who catches a serial killer, archetypal hero, becomes an SS mass murderer.
For the crimes that Georg Heuser committed, he was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment, of which he served 6. So we have to wonder who the bad guys are in this story.